Very great pleasure to be here. A lot of friends. I was just telling quite a few people here that my association with Max Mueller Bhavan goes back to 1969. So when we're talking about journeys and old routes, new routes, old journeys, I've done a production in this space. So I feel very close to it. And I also feel very increasingly close to IFA for coming up with such an imaginative and creative way of facilitating access. And I do believe this has every potential of being an important meeting at multiple levels. So I like being here. So I'd like to thank IFA for bringing together such a diverse spectrum of perspectives on two of the most vexed institutions of our times, the museum and the archive. Arguably, these institutions in the Indian context have yet to be adequately decolonized, professionalized, activated, and made accountable in the public domain. While the general discourse and practice of these institutions may be bleak, my sense is that we could be at the cusp of thinking about museums and archives differently. The innovations and experiences being foregrounded in this conference, and there are many players in this room, some of whom have been working for a long time, like Shubha Chowdhury, on archives, many other global players, and I feel that collectively, these interventions could provide a template for a more sustained discourse and practice that hopefully will not be restricted to the metropolis or to global art circuits. In this regard, I'm struck by the fact that IFA has consciously supported museum projects in unlikely locations like Kargil and Nagaland, where one would not expect museums and archives to exist. I think that indicates our parochialism, and I think we have a lot to learn. The title of the conference, Old Routes, New Journeys, borrowed from Abir Gupta's project, has many possible permutations. New routes, old journeys, old routes, old journeys, new routes, new journeys. When I think of these possible permutations, I'm reminded of one of my favorite performance conventions from the tradition of Kudiyatam. Now, most people think, oh, Kudiyatam is this ancient performance tradition, Sanskrit tradition. For me, it's a cutting-edge, contemporary performance practice. And in Kudiyatam, you have this convention called the Nirvahanam, which could be described as a journey of the mind in the form of a flashback. So what happens in the Nirvahanam is that a particular character presents himself or herself at a particular point in the narrative, generally medias res, somewhere in the middle. This introduction could take around 8 hours. Just when you expect the character to take a step forwards and get on with the journey, he or she takes a step backwards and proceeds to go backwards over several nights of performance, revisiting and reliving particular points of departure in the journey. Perhaps at some point in time there could be a backflip into another yuga. And just when you think that the character has disappeared at vanishing point, there is a sharp jump cut, and the character returns to the present from where he or she had started a journey, but not necessarily on the same route. So, is the character returning to the past or forging ahead into the future? I'd like to keep this ambivalence alive in my own journey through some reflexive observations on a few museums and archives which have left impressions which I'd like to share with you. So my journey begins in the 1980s when I was not really thinking about museums or archives at all. Let's face it, one grows up in India without necessarily visiting museums on a regular basis. They are not part of the cultural habitus of everyday life. I don't believe that we have a museum culture. We may have an emergent gallery culture, but it's no museum culture. And therefore, we have to think about museums very differently, I would say, from the European context, where going to the museums is a pretty regular habit. Archives are even more remote. Now, in the 1980s, I remember attending a conference in Pune on the documentation of social movements. That was my first introduction. Documenting any movement, I would argue, whether it is in the form of dance or through the dynamics of a social and political movement, is fraught with risks, not least because the moment one decides to document any process, it is no longer processual. The phenomenological flow of any movement, with its multitudinous shifts of energy and direction, gets arrested in the form of a constellation of moments. In the documentation conference in Pune, the focus was not on the phenomenology of movements. Phenomenology interests me a lot in the context of museums. The focus was more on the veracity of evidence. So I remember one feminist activist recalling the first stages of creating women's documentation centers in the late 1970s. We have a veteran here, Susie Tharu, and I'm sure she might recall this moment in a slightly different context. And I remember this activist saying, we thought that we knew everything about the movement in which we had participated. We had the experience, we had the knowledge, but when it came to documenting the movements, we realized that we had to create our evidence. Those words have remained with me for a very long time, and they continue to resonate. What does it mean to create evidence? At one level, it highlights the axiomatic truth that evidence is never a given. One cannot simply rely on the truth of first-hand experience. There's a wonderful essay in this regard by Joan Scott on the evidence of experience. Just as facts have to be produced, evidence has to be shaped, framed, edited from larger bodies of experience, and placed within a discursive framework with a specific intentionality. In documenting any social or political movement then, a cultural movement, what evidence does one choose to highlight? Are the failures of the movement or the breakdowns in interpersonal relationships part of the evidence that one chooses to highlight? Perhaps not. Going back to the expression creating evidence, what does it specifically imply in the context of art practice? Here we have many possibilities of intervention in terms of performing the archive, and we're going to have one such instance tomorrow where we actually see an artist performing in archive. And as evidence is subjected to play, irreverence, perhaps even subterfuge and fiction, as in the case of the Rax Collective's treatment of Rosa Luxemburg's missing body and of Zuleika Chowdhury's dramaturgical reenactments of court trials, actual court trials, where the uncertainties of evidence are brought into focus to trouble the ostensibly authentic truths available in the archive. So this is a small little clue of my kind of perceptual engagement with archives as a user, but now I'd like to really focus on my engagement with the archive as a listener and perhaps a co-producer. My first real engagement with the archive came somewhat later in 1997 or so, through a 3-year interaction with what could be described as a living archive. Here I'm referring to my conversations with Komal Kothari, who had this prodigious knowledge of material culture and life practices of communities living in the desert. While I was absorbed in listening to him for hours on end for 3 years, I did not think of him as an archive. But my own process of documenting the act of listening made me realize that I may have been in touch with a fully embodied living archive, which had stored a multitude of empirical observations of life in the desert over a period of 50 years. Now, my question would be, in what way was this archive different from the archive contained in a building or as represented through a collection of manuscripts and objects? I would call attention here to a specific production of knowledge that gets communicated through the voice and the act of listening. When I mean listening, I don't think listening is just with the ears. You listen with your body. And this act of knowledge gets communicated, I would say, in our particular content. No specific time constraint or academically defined agenda. The technological mediation of our conversations through the insertion of a microphone for at least some of the conversations was minimal, but it cannot be denied. I would acknowledge then that it was this almost invisible insertion of the microphone that enabled the conversations to be archived in the form of a book. So there is always some kind of a technological mediation that you have to deal with when you're talking about archives. However subtle, however informal, however amateur, however invisible. The technological mediations, it might be a little microphone. Now let me try to reconstruct a fragment from my memory of Komaldar as a living archive. He could, for instance, have been talking about soil, which he would effortlessly contextualize within a spectrum of different soils using ethnogeographic categories. The focus on soil would then lead to the various grasses growing on the soil, which could then lead even more specifically to a mention of the Sevan grass, which during the monsoon grows to a height of 6 to 7 feet, in which camels can be said to disappear. This is not an image, but an observation. The Sevan grass growing area then gets identified with the cultivation of bajra, pearl millet. And where bajra is found, you can be sure to hear the Ravanhatha, or fiddle, which is inextricably linked to the singing of the epic of Pabuji. So from ethnobotany to oral epics, one is listening here to a journey of the mind, another kind of nirvahanam, which could be described as a map of interconnected bodies of knowledge extending spatially on the ground and not in some metaphysical realm. And I bring that up because there are scholars like Kapila Vatsayana, for example, who also uses the category of interconnectedness, but dare I say, on a Himalayan level. So one would be tempted to describe Komaldar's mode of thinking as rhizomatic, as outlined by Deleuze and Guattari, where there is no one root for the evolution of any element, but a network and assemblage of elements with multiple possible roots and connections. Even as archives today, particularly those exploring digital technologies, can be said to be experimenting on similar lines and going way beyond, through multiple tracks of searches for particular categories and terms, the difficulty, the challenge is that it's really very hard to ultimately let go of the armature, the grammatology of what constitutes an archive in the first place. Even the most aleatory, random of digital research experiments is compelled at some point to deal with the strictures of classification. In contrast, Komaldar could be argued loved nomenclature and categories in his own right, but he had this uncanny knack of not allowing them to get locked or boxed in specific taxonomies. Perhaps he was able to do this because he was not disciplined by any professional training as an archivist, and therefore could afford to share his knowledge through a free flow of observations in the mode of a conversation. But it was not as simple and free-flowing as we think it is. There's a logic there. I offer his way of thinking not as a model for inventing new archives, but as a suggestive template for creating more multi-dimensional circuits of knowledge. It was through Komaldar that the archive and the museum in my journey got linked. By the time I had published Rajasthan and Oral History based on my conversations with him, he was already conceptualizing the blueprint of an ethnographic museum of the desert, which would focus tantalizingly on the broom, the jharu. More on that later. Sadly, Komaldar passed away before the museum could be built, and a year later I found myself working as a project director of a museum which I named Arna Jharna, the Desert Museum of Rajasthan. Could we have the first slide, please? Yeah. So it's called Arna Jharna because the area is called Arna Jharna. Today the museum still exists. It exists with a slightly different name. Now, along with brooms, we also have musical instruments. The director of the museum is Kuldeep Kothari, that's Komal Kothari's son. We are still in touch. Do we have the second image, please? Okay. So, what I'd like to address here is not the present state of the museum, but how this museum came into being. In a sense, the phenomenology of the museum in a somewhat personal register and testimony. And for this purpose, I will have to take you to that point in my journey when I met Komaldar for the last time, when he took me to the site of the museum for the first time. Blank, please, in the lights. So, site. Let's focus on that. In our preoccupation with finding space for our museological endeavors in the metropolis, space that is hopelessly hard to find and determined by unaffordable rentals and real estate demands, we almost never think of the site, the land, the ground on which our imaginary museums could be built. I think this is a limitation that immunizes us to the possibilities of thinking about museums at an ecological level. In contrast, the site of the Arna Jharna Museum almost flaunted the destruction of ecology surrounding it, insofar as it has been built on the remains of a sandstone mine. So the sandstone was not a very good quality, so the mine was abandoned, leaving behind a huge pit. So this abandoned sandstone mine is the primary ground which has shaped the vision of the museum. With no Arna or Jharna in sight, the museum cannot be separated from the larger devastation of the ecology in an area marked by numerous mines and quarries. This is mafia land. This mafia has destroyed the land, it's destroyed the ecology, and no one can do it. I remember my first sight of Arna Jharna at the crossroads, where we stopped the car to witness an awesome sight. A vast field of bones and the skeletal remains of animals in a dumping ground that resembled the aftermath of a battle. As I trained my eyes to take in the omnipresence of bones, I noticed patches of pink and blue appearing sporadically in the discolored and bleached bones, clumps of plastic embedded in the remains of the animals. An image that is at once hideous, grotesque, and pitiable. I pointed out the plastic to Komaldar, who merely shrugged his shoulders while munching his betel nut. The toxic waste of plastic was familiar to him. That was not the narrative he wished to pursue. Instead, he urged our team members to look more closely at the bones. Are the horns and hooves of the animals intact? A strange question. He clarified. Bones are worth a lot of money. They're used in the glue and pharmaceutical industries. He didn't say anything more. But I could read the larger context that he was addressing. This happens in any archive. The more one allows oneself to get immersed in its content and ambience, the archive almost begins to speak itself. This is how I read the living archive speaking. If bones are worth a lot of money, they have to be collected. In order to be collected, they first have to be severed, cut from the skeletal remains of animals. For this purpose, tools are necessary and skills to use these tools in the first place. Collected, severed, tools, skills. One can be sure that in a country like India, where bare life in Giorgio Agamben's terms exists in the state of inclusive exclusion, that the lowest of low caste communities, the most untouchable of untouchables, will be relegated, indeed delegated by society and the agencies of the state to collect bones and skin dead animals. That's their job. Here one could cut the narrative and say that this could be the point of departure for a museum dedicated to representing the degradation and dehumanization of caste. Komaldar would not deny the validity of this intervention, but as always, I believe he would push the premise of such a museum somewhat further by suggesting that bone collectors also need to be remembered as singers. In the numerous stories of bone collectors which he shared with me, I learned about their dual identities, their occasionally incognito existence, and also their part-time occupations as genealogists and epic singers. Just once, I remember Komaldar telling me that their songs have a cosmic scale as they embrace the elements. Sadly, I did not pursue that moment, and I find myself today facing a sense of loss. So, what does one do at such moments of loss in any archive? The archive, one should keep in mind, is never as omniscient as it might appear to be. It is as much determined by its gaps and silences as it is by the plenitude of its materials. This is very true of Komaldar. After writing the book, it became very clear to me, knowledge is imperfect. Knowledge can only exist through its gaps and silences. And if you don't have those gaps and silences, that knowledge actually is not very precious. It becomes a kind of expertise. So when one faces an impasse in any archive, I would like to tell you and suggest that this can be seen as a productive moment because it compels one to search elsewhere. At times, out of the blue, one can find a connection, if not a revelation. Such was my experience when I discovered quite recently the translation of 12th century artisan bhakti poems, vachanas, in Kannada by my colleague H.S. Shivaprakash, where labor lies at the center of these devotional poems written by representatives of the most humble professions: a woodcutter, a washerman, a ferryman, a toddy tapper, a cowherd, a barber, a town crier. Among these poems, there is one in which Magara Dhulya, a cobbler, skins dead animals. The poem: everyone pierces the cattle hide in awareness. Everyone pierces the cattle hide in forgetfulness. But I pierced the hide of dead cattle. When I cut away the hide and the truthful put the sandals on, I long for them to show me emptiness. Extraordinary poems. You don't know what to make of them, actually. At one level, it could be said that this poem is from another location in India. It speaks and was sung centuries ago in another language, Kannada. But it is dealing with the same task of skinning dead animals which continues to this day. So the past, the present, and the future cannot just be separated and segmented, you know. It is through such connections that the mind is open to the task involved in curating the songs of the downtrodden. Of what use is it to merely collect these songs? How does one connect them, indeed ground them, within the realities that have given birth to them? At Arna Jharna, the focus was on the broom. Could we have the image? Jharu. The most, I have to have some light, most ordinary and marginal of objects. I've learned from my 3-year engagement of working with the broom never to take the ordinary for granted. At first, when Komaldar mentioned the broom, it had seemed folkloric, if not trivial. Only when one takes the ordinary seriously, when one gives the broom and the labor that goes into making the broom, Only when one gives the broom as much dedicated seeing and thought as one would a manuscript or a sculpture or a tapestry can an entire world get illuminated. In the broom, therefore, one can be alerted to a vista of insights relating to the biodiversity of the desert, different modalities of broom production, the relationships between labor, material, and caste, the shamanic and healing propensities of the broom, the all-India trade and business surrounding the broom, the political appropriations of the broom by the Aam Aadmi Party, Swachh Bharat campaign, and so on. I've reflected on that in an earlier intervention in MMB. In retrospect, I would say that we needed more time and expertise at Arnajharna in enabling the brooms in our collection to tell their own stories. Next. So I don't like looking at this image because I think the brooms are just too docile out here. So they have little tags and, you know, a lot of work has gone into them. It's quite tasteful, but I feel a little uncomfortable. I feel today it would not have been too difficult for us in terms of attaching headphones to each broom, where the personal history of each broom could have been shared by those selling or gifting the broom to the museums. However, in hindsight, I would say that one needed to anticipate this curatorial strategy during the archival research of the broom before the museum even came into existence. When you ask me, how do you build a museum? Where do you build a museum? You have to sometimes begin before the beginning. Otherwise, it may be too late. Blank, please, and lights. In the final analysis, I would say that what makes the Arnajharna Museum a small but memorable experiment for me is not so much its collection of brooms, but the way in which the pit left behind by the miners when they abandoned the sandstone mine has now been transformed into a lake. Could we have the next slide? A lake which accumulates water through rudimentary water harvesting techniques, relying just on 2 or 3 rainfalls. That's all you need to create this body of water, just 2 or 3 rainfalls. Today, this lake provides water for almost a year to an entire community of humans, animals, and birds. I would say it is this concrete achievement which almost disappears into the landscape that one can speak of the museum's ecosystem. Next image. So you might ask, where is the museum? And that's what interests me. Thank you. Blank. Okay. I would say that the Arnajharna Museum had the makings of a truly innovative eco-museum. But it was never envisioned as a community museum. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to reflect a little bit on community museums and problematize community museums in 3 contexts, from Oaxaca, Mexico, South Africa, and Detroit, the United States. I don't offer them as models, just something to bounce off and to think, because where are our community museums in India and how do they exist? That's what I want to open up here. Now, at one level, it could be argued that we at Arnajharna were dealing with different communities of broom makers: Banjara, Koli, Bargunda, Bagaria, and the self-identified Harijan community, all of whose voices come through loud and clear in the educational film Jharu Katha, directed by Navroz Contractor, which was made in the 3rd year of my tenure as project director. And I should say, this is a practical kind of insight that film has probably circulated more than the museum itself. Something to think about. Within the framework of the museum itself, these communities could be regarded as the resource persons of the museum's research, and they are acknowledged as such. However, it would be false to claim that they had any agency in the actual conceptualization of the museum as decision makers. Nor would it be possible to claim that they had ownership rights to the museum even as it would be hard to figure out who owns the broom in the first place. All these questions came to a head with the visit of Teresa Morales to Arunacharna. Teresa Morales is a very, very committed community museum activist from Oaxaca, Mexico, who has been an active participant in the community museum movement in Oaxaca since its inception. From Morales, we learned, and this is her perspective, that for a community museum to exist, communities have to be the initiators of the museum-making process. It is community representatives who are generally identified as living in one particular village, sharing certain kinds of values, traditions, etc. It is community representatives who manage and direct the museum, carry out the research and design exhibitions. In other words, they don't accept outer kind of, external kind of support. They do it themselves. Criticizing the generalized concept of museum as participatory process, Morales emphatically questions the rights of so-called local actors to represent the community, even as these actors may contribute to the museum through financial support, transportation, tourist and catering services. So she makes a very clear, almost a polemical distinction between community and so-called local actors, which is a word we hear a lot of in today's sort of funding language. At a philosophical level, this focus on the agency and decision-making communities of capacities takes us back to Paulo Freire's affirmation of the ontological vocation of the subject and its implicit critique of allowing marginalized people to become mere spectators and objects of a social transformation controlled by others. At a practical level, however, one is compelled to ask, what are the ground realities that enable members of communities belonging to particular villages in Oaxaca to run museums on a collective basis? How is this possible at a practical level? From Morales' conversations at Arunacharna, it became clear that it is the collective ownership of land in Oaxaca on the basis of ancestral rights, where there is absolutely no concept of private property, that makes it possible for museums to be owned collectively in the first place. So the museum is simply an extension of a logic that already exists in everyday life. There's nothing new. So in this context, community members see their work in the museum as a form of community seva. I cannot help problematizing this seva. What if an individual in the community does not want to serve the museum? I am told that such an individual is likely to face punitive measures, if not forms of social ostracism. Likewise, I find myself questioning the predominantly male domination of village councils, which are not very different from our panchayats, which leaves one seeking clarification of the rights of women as decision makers, even as they work in the museum full-time. Clearly, the model of the community museum in Oaxaca cannot be easily translated in other communitarian contexts, including Mexico. But it does compel one to question how other forms of community-driven museums can be sustained, or should I say, invented in the first place in the Indian context. Even the few failures in this regard should be placed on record as processes of learning. I'm thinking here of the Koralai Community Museum in the Raigad district of Maharashtra, which was initiated in 1999 by Professor V.H. Ambedkar from the University of Baroda, who had interacted closely with the Indo-Portuguese community in Koralai on the rejuvenation of their cultural practices and language. Professor Ambedkar had actually referred to this experiment in the context of an eco-museum, not a community museum, and there are all kinds of theoretical divides between these terms. I'm not going to go into that. The point is that he worked very, very closely with this community. The museum no longer exists, okay? But my point is, why can't we think about it? And why can't we think about other such ventures, and maybe there are other such ventures which we need to be informed about? The other point I want to throw out for discussion And I'm trying to open the ways in which museums can be envisioned, the different modalities out of which museums can be envisioned. I'm trying to throw out here the relationship between social movements and the formation of museums. We have so many social movements in this country. How many of them have resulted in something like a museum? And this relationship between social movements and the formation of museums brings me to my second example, the District 6 Museum of Cape Town, South Africa, to which I have a very personal connection. District 6 is often recognized in South African cultural history as a vibrant, multiracial center of mixed communities of freed slaves, merchants, sailors, artisans, laborers, and immigrants. There's a saying that captures the intimacies of this community, which was not free of violence, sex, music, and gang wars. And the saying is, the District Sixers were drinking out of the same monks. Needless to say, this is not what the apartheid regime could tolerate. No sharing of spit. So as early as 1901, black South Africans living in District 6 were displaced. By 1966, District 6 was declared a white area under the Group Areas Act, and as many as 60,000 people were forcibly evicted and relocated to the Cape Flats. By 1982, the actual topography of District 6 was razed to the ground, all its houses and shops demolished. Very brutal. And it was out of this rubble that a movement was born in which District 6ers resolved to return to District 6. I want you to translate this into our own scenarios in India of displacement and other such realities. And it was out of this movement that the District 6 Museum was born to consolidate memories of District 6 and to create a hub for a movement of resistance. In my journey, it would be hard for me to think of any other museum which has been built with so much love, texture, and attention to detail. So that's the very familiar interior of District 6. You have this very iconic installation of the street signs, actual street signs, and you have this map on the floor. So the map becomes very interactive. It's grown over the years. People come and inscribe their own homes to this map. It's very homely, as you can see, and there's something very beautiful about this museum. Next slide, please. Just another, that's a fresco on the wall, the little niches and your little alcoves, and it's a very, very homely kind of quality. It's an abandoned church, so that the museum is also part of the church. Next slide. Okay, so the museum has been transformed into an assembly. So this is where actual meetings took place in District 6, to actually fight for the return of land. So this is a political meeting, and you realize how that one space can take on so many different kinds of, formations. Thanks. Blank, please. But what is the situation today? Within the realities of post-apartheid South Africa, where racism continues to exist, despite a progressive constitution and the rhetoric of a rainbow nation, where an overwhelming majority of black South Africans continue to live in misery alongside the emergence of a new black elite, where District 6 is now a super cool location with staggering real estate prices for land, where the District 6 Museum itself is a success story, a model for community museums worldwide, and a national heritage site, one needs to ask the crucial question: does the raison d'etre of the museum have any validity today? And indeed, do the former District 6ers wish to return to District 6, or have they got used to living in their second homes, which is often the condition of many refugees? So there are huge contradictions raised through these questions, but sadly, the curatorial scheme of the District 6 Museum remains more or less intact. So here it is. What was tender and loving, a home away from home, is now beginning to resemble what I would call the old curiosity shop. The politics of nostalgia has overwhelmed the necessity of engaging with the immediacies of the here and the now. And that's the problem. Blank. So to address the realities of both the new South African state and the state of the museum, which is no longer symbiotically linked to the movement which had initiated the museum, and that's the crucial problem. The museum and the movement have parted ways. I fear that another kind of violence is necessary. Not the violence of destruction, but the conscious decision to deconstruct the museum's most precious memorabilia, to tell new stories which were perhaps too harsh and somewhat too painful to be fully revealed when the museum was first imagined. And that's not an easy thing to do. Like if you ask me, deconstruct our Najharna and the Brugel Museum, I have to do it if I went back. But it would be very painful to do it. But sometimes you have to go through that pain. What I'm trying to point out here, friends, is that museums are not for posterity. They're always in the making. And in the making, there is an inevitable process of unmaking even the most precious assumptions underlying a particular curatorial scheme. In this regard, I would emphasize that the funding imperatives of sustainability, which is probably one of the most talismanic kinds of categories associated with the world of funding, I would say that the funding imperatives of sustainability need to take into account the creative need to deconstruct and to constantly question the museum's raison d'etre, which in practical terms does increase the overheads of a museum's running costs. More work. A museum that is fixed forever may be more affordable, but it is more or less dead. Let me end my journey by referring briefly to yet another museum, the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn, you may know, is the headquarters of Ford, and Dearborn is part of the larger Detroit industrial area, which today has completely collapsed, and it is more like a wasteland. So the Arab American National Museum is yet another instance of a museum that has emerged out of a movement which is now consolidated as one of the largest Arab American non-profit community organizations in the United States, called Access. I bring up this example at one level to get us to think about how NGOs in our country can see community museums as part of their social and political outreach. I'm afraid most of our NGOs are completely devoid of imagination. Absolutely, it's an imagination crisis there, you know. And if they turn to anything cultural, then they're always trying to kind of hide under the masquerade of corporate social responsibility, which is more useful for tax cuts and things like that. I mean, when you're talking of Access, you're really talking of a massive kind of organization which is still linked to the idea of struggle. So through a long struggle, beginning in 1971, when volunteers in Dearborn began to provide services to Arab immigrants, Access has grown at a phenomenal pace. Post 9/11, it decided to support a museum to counter the stigmatization and stereotyping of the Arab community. So once again, I'm trying to say that the museum just doesn't grow like that. It's not a random thing. It comes out of movement. It comes out of social and political needs. In the derelict ruins of Detroit's hinterland, where one can visibly encounter the sheer collapse of 19th century American capitalism, in a bleak landscape of deserted streets, vacant skyscrapers, boarded shops, and abandoned homes, the Arab American National Museum is nothing short of an oasis. Through the sheer grace of its architecture, its ambience of hospitality, its uncomplicated narrative of the civilizational layers in Arab history, and the success stories of Arab American immigrants within an understated yet implicit reiteration of the American dream, It could be argued that the museum plays into a feel-good post-9/11 scenario where it is almost obligatory for former immigrants to prove their national credentials, hence Arab American National Museum. So this was more or less the underlying thrust of my response to Anan Ameri, the Palestine-born founding director of the Arab American National Museum, a very tough activist, who, while driving me back to my hotel from the museum, shot a question at me. So what do you think, Rustom? Put on the spot, I would say. Such was the directness of the question that I realized it would not be possible to equivocate. I had to speak the truth. So I found myself saying, I think the museum perhaps is somewhat soft on racism. Its referencing of 9/11 and Islamophobia is quite minimal, almost elliptical. And the earlier history of racial violence in the Arab community perhaps is curated somewhat too subtly. At some point she cut me short and said, I don't think so. I was silent. As we continued to drive through Dearborn's derelict streets, which radiated an almost formidable aura of the sheer brutality of poverty, I found myself asking a question, one of those questions that emerges unthinkingly from one's unconscious and which often gets me into trouble. What keeps you going? I asked Anand. She responded with one word, rage. At that moment, I realized something important. While my observations about the museum's soft curatorial scheme were perhaps on the mark, what I had failed to grasp was its political strategy. Most of all, I had failed to realize that even as one may appear to pursue a soft line, this does not mean that the rage against poverty, injustice, and racism has been exhausted. In our context in India, where museums and archives are blatantly neglected, bureaucratized, and more often than not subjected to the most flagrant indifference and lack of public concern, where some of our national treasures in museums are stored in basements flooded with water, where manuscripts in so-called archives disintegrate as we touch them, we have a right to rage. But this rage, I would add, should not just be mobilized in an oppositional context or polemicized merely through words. It needs to be strategized through new imaginaries of resistance, for which new long-term infrastructures of support by funding agencies are necessary, not just for one-off creative projects, but for a sustainable institutionalization of museums and archives which have the tools to question and keep questioning the challenge, traps, and risks of institutionalization itself. In this journey, which has yet to begin, it is not just artists who have to come up with new creative strategies, but activists, policymakers, and funding agencies as well, who have as much responsibility to reimagine the futures of museums and archives in India today. It is my hope that this forum can provide the ground for articulating some of the key strategies and imaginary blueprints that can take our journey forwards. Thank you.
Should we take some questions,
Sure.
comments from the audience? There's another mic, I guess, no? On that side. It would be great if you just say your name, so most of you, everybody knows, but there are also a lot of youngsters. Great.
Shubha Chaudhary here. Rustom, thanks for that and bringing a lot of shared memories together. Very simple question actually from Anna Channa. I was wondering why you did not focus on the video, which is an important part of the broom maker's presence in the museum.
I've done this in the video is huge. It's a film.
No, I'm talking about the videos that were part of the display in the Broom Gallery.
Yeah, I should have brought that up. Yeah, I just to bounce off that. It was a real learning experience for me. When I first went into that context, I had a kind of wary attitude towards technology, and some kind of false kinds of qualms. But when we actually started doing the museum, and the museum is made out of mud, so it's a very indigenous kind of architecture, I found, oddly enough, a great deal of excitement in embedding high quality video into the mud wall. I found it very, very personally I felt that was the edge that was needed. Secondly, I found that all our rural spectators and museum goers, they like the video. They're very proud of the videos when they see themselves. And this is video made by Navroz contractor. Very high, very fine, I think, video making. And one very interesting thing in terms of museum going, in all these big museums, they tell you, they actually program the number of minutes that people are likely to spend in each room, 8 minutes. Well, not with our audience. Our audience would just sit down on the floor and wanted to see everything. So it would be 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever, it didn't make a difference. I think actually the experiment made me realize the importance of technology. I think we have to start, I think people are already doing it, it's nothing new. But I think this is something we have to spend a little more time. What kinds of technologies are we talking about? So for example, the simple suggestion that I made, after the fact, that I really would have liked each room to have headphones and a story. I mean, it's a very simple thing to do. It's not difficult. It's not that we didn't have the stories, but we didn't have them recorded. You see? So that's what I'm trying to say, that when does the museum begin? It's a process, and it was a very difficult process to get this off the ground. Even to get those brooms in that space with that color, it was tough work. But I just wish that we had, I don't know, it's not hindsight, I suppose, but while we were actually doing the archival research, that those recordings could have been actually done. Some of them were done, but very specific stories. You can't cheat here. If somebody is gifting you a broom, there's something very big in that gesture. And many of our brooms, they fall into 2 categories. Those which are manufactured and produced in America, and those which are personally made. And a lot of brooms are made, especially by women. They make their own brooms out of whatever is available. So when that broom is given to you, my God, that is a very, very big gift. So those stories I wish had been recorded. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, it is important.
A lot of the stories were there.
Yeah, they were there in the, I have to say, he started out with the ethnographic museum, and I think many people will be talking of ethnographic museums. It's fraught with all kinds of perils. So when I started, I still remember falling into all the traps of trying to come up with little placards and information sheets. It was impossible. And I felt getting the video to actually show the action of the broom was in some ways a better way of dealing with the situation.
Hi. Hello?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting, especially with the diverse examples you gave. My name is Paris. I'm German-American, and I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship that you talked about in the last example of the softer tactics, which the curator or the director of the museum defended, because when we're talking about sort of curatorial and museum and archival creation practice as a form of activism, then a lot of times, these are in spaces where, I guess especially in India or anywhere, funding comes from people who wouldn't want such radical projects. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where to locate oneself in that space between sort of setting up archival museums museum experiences that aren't didactic,
Yes.
but also leave space for sort of that like slow, soft power, and then how that approach can be defended by those on the left who are quite insistent on being radical, as one should be. But I mean, I'm working on a project based on a massacre in North Carolina in 1898 that's still not talked about by the white community. And so in order to even launch an archival collection about that, I'll have to do it in a way that won't freak out all the white people. And then, you know, I'm already criticizing myself because it's not radical enough, but otherwise it just won't happen.
Yes. Thank you for your very rich question. I was taken by surprise because Anan Ameri, who's now running an organization only for Palestinian refugees, she's a very, very tough person. Her radicalism is very intense. So for her to ask me this question, you know, and that's why I bring up that conversation, and I use the conversational mode because I feel that was the only mode I could really address it in at the moment. But it did, I just wanted to throw that out, that what seemed to me like a very soft curatorial, you know, where 9/11 is hardly there, you know, you'd like 9/11 to be in your face, you'd like it to be raging at you and all that. But she's a shrewd activist, you know, and this is, by the way, not her choice alone. It's coming out of a whole group of people of access. So it's, I would say there was a kind of discussion that went into what kind of a museum do we want, how much do we really want it to be aggressive and pitch it, how do we counter stigmatization and stereotyping. So for me, it was an education in that sense, because I would have gone for a much tougher tactic. I would have gone with much harsher kind of evidence in all kinds of ways. You know, it's possible to do that. And so when she, and because I respect her politics so much, and it is very much a politics on the left, when she was not exactly defending, I think, I haven't had a conversation with her since, but she kind of made me realize the importance of strategy. I think that's the important thing for any act of resistance. What's the strategy, you know? I mean, I'm in JNU at the moment, where we are going through hell, and we're fighting all the time. We have a confrontation every single day. Amazing work is going on in JNU. I mean, I'm very, very proud of my colleagues in that. But sometimes I wonder, is the strategy correct? You know, and how do you create that strategy? I think this is something we need to, you know, start thinking about. It's not just political activists who have to think about strategy. Curators have to think about strategy. I'd love to know more about your project and how the soft need not be a cop-out, you know. But I would also then go back to my point and say, I don't want, maybe I wouldn't want the curatorial scheme to remain as it was. I'd like it to change. So that is my real point, that do we have the resources, both financial, conceptual, and political, to keep recurating? But that's not an easy task, you know. So maybe at that point, Anna and Mary, I wonder what she would think today, because she's no longer with the museum. So you know, it's an important question for me to think about, but I think what it makes me think about in a broader term is the importance of strategy, creative strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rustom, for your wonderful talk. And I'm Rajasri Biswal, a researcher from JNU. And I think if you can elaborate a little more about the distinction you talk about local actors and community while talking about any community initiative project, that will be very significant for me, because sometimes the local actors also part of the community.
Yes.
And it depends the degree of participation and the nature of decision making and political and in what level. So and in relation to funding and projecting it as a community project. So if you can elaborate.
See, for me, that distinction is not my distinction. That's the distinction made by Teresa Morales. That's her criticism, actually. She has a real criticism of actually, well, a certain kind of affirmation of eco-museums by de Varine, you know, the famous theorist, who sees eco-museums in the context of heritage and territory and community. She's coming from the Oaxaca context. And yes, at some level, her reading of community could seem a bit exclusionary, you know, because she's saying only community, which means people who are living in a particular village, sharing certain codes, values, memories, etc. Local actors, I think it's a kind of term that circulates a great deal in funding rhetoric, you know, that we talk about local actors could be the funders themselves. They would want to be called as local actors, or it could be people who provide tourist services, all kinds of, you know, important things. But she would try to say they should not, perhaps reading her position, appropriate the role of the community, and by doing so claim a kind of ownership to the community museum. So she's making a very sharp kind of line, but I would be more inclined to agree with you that the lines are not always that clear, you know, and local actors can indeed be, you know, members of the community. And we also have to be a little more open to the processes of relationships. Maybe over a certain point in time, somebody who's a photographer, somebody who's a caterer or a cook or whatever, but is helping you, becomes part of your community. I would like to have a more open-ended attitude to community. I would love to question Teresa Morales on this, and I wonder to what extent it is really helping the community museum movement to hold on to such a, I would say, rigid distinction between community and local actors. That would be.
Thank you, Rustom, for this wonderful presentation. I'm Kapati Goethe-Institut. I wanted to take you up on something that was coming out of the last conversation about the relationship between activisms, radical movements, and the forming of alternative kinds of museums that you've talked about. And there are large numbers of examples you throw open. And I wanted to particularly take you up with Komal Kothari's vision and the District 6 Museum examples that you said. Now you seem to imply that when, and you use the term anger, reclaiming, when the originary vision that often drives many of these, thinking of the District 6 Museum in particular, about putting things out there, reclaiming a space from which generations had been removed. And you talk about once that primary, you use the term anger, that kind of emotional investment, once that begins to fade in a different generation, you said it's very easy for it to become like a curiosity shop. But I wanted to kind of ask you that in some sense, that kind of anger, and you use the term what keeps it going, anger, cannot be a lasting frame. So if you assume that the move from any kind of activism that leads into the making of a museum, however open one may be to recurating it continuously, must one not assume that somewhere the museum must take on a life that may even leave behind, and that's why you said somebody is no longer involved with it. That somewhere, once the collection is made, once the collective has been formed, is one open to the idea, because otherwise the link between activism and museum making will always seem to end like the moment you make the museum, you've frozen something in time, and then there is no longer that openness, and therefore one will need to talk about strategy, a softening of things. But I'm wondering whether the museum that comes out of it, whether Anna Jhanna, the District 6, say the Bhopal gas tragedy kind of the museum that is coming up, whether these do not then become, one we can say, sites of a different kinds of memory formation itself, which one needs to then hold on to. And maybe often the initial movements that drove them may not always be the grounds on which their continuing life may be, you know, assured. I mean, I'm putting it out in a more abstract way, but I'm trying to think that somewhere to keep on thinking that the museum must remain the site of that activism that made it may not be a practical one. But they do become sites of memory formations and often of inherited memories and where that would become important. So I think of District 6 Museum as a space where inherited memories become very important. So that for a different group, and it would be important for many, many other, thinking of the partition museums that has come up in Amritsar. It is also about the refusal to let another generation forget.
Yeah.
I think that becomes a very, very important way in which many of these museums work.
Yeah, I think there are different memory formations. It's just that because I happen to know members of that community, there's a lot of unrest within the community in relation to where the District 6 Museum is positioned today. So if the museum reconciles itself to, yeah, we have a museum, our activism is in the past, the struggle has moved on, I'll just accept, okay, that's a choice. But there seems to be a lot of inner dissent within members of the community. And I would just like to say, you don't have to, that's why when it's a dangerous, when I was actually thinking of Walter Benjamin's The Destructive Character. I don't know if you know that wonderful essay where violence is not necessarily seen in this very negative light. Violence can also be seen in the context of exuberance and creativity, And I am only actually asking for something quite modest, I would say, which would be a deconstruction of the existing curatorial scheme. So, for example, I'll give you one example where if I had the position to do it, the street signs. I'd begin with the street signs. Now, where did the street signs come from? I did a little bit of research. The street signs, after District 6 was demolished, the street signs were preserved by the head of the demolition team. He held on to the street signs. And for some reason, he kept it under his bed for a very long time. He didn't know what to do with it. Somehow or the other, the District 6ers came to realize when they wanted the street signs, they said, oh God, we've got to go to Mr. Demolition Man and request him, please return our street signs to us. It's an incredible story, It's like, you're going back to the devil or whatever, and you're saying, you destroyed us. Could you give us the evidence of that destruction? Because it's ours. Now, that's the kind of story that was not, in the first curatorial scheme, and understandably so. You want to remember the good memories of the street signs, whatever, the Sullivan Street, this street, that street. But maybe there comes a point in time, and there are many ways of doing this. Curatorial strategies are very open. I'm not saying you've got to get rid of the street signs. You might just have a different voice over there. You might just have a different panel over there. Little things, So, I can sense where you're coming from. You're a true museum person. You invest a lot in the museum and in the way museums can generate different memories. I'll give you one example from Germany. My favorite museum, the most anachronistic museum, most archaic museum, but my favorite museum. Very politically incorrect. This was the Dahlem Museum, the ethnology museum, Dahlem, which is now moving to the new place. Okay, so I used to love going there because it's just frozen in time, literally frozen in time. I used to get a strange kind of pleasure going there. It's like especially the Oceania room. The Oceania room with all this National Geographic type of colors and fishing nets and rods and things like that. So I went there quite often. One day I went there and guess what? There was just a little television and 4 chairs inside that space. Nothing had changed. What was on the television? They were documenting and showing nuclear tests conducted by the French government in Tahiti and the trauma that it was eliciting in the local population. That's all it did. That is what I mean by an insertion. That's all you really need to do at that point. It was a very deft piece of curating, I would say. So nothing changes. You see the fishing nets and the rods and all the beautiful colors, and you're watching a nuclear test and the way it's absolutely destroying human beings. It was a very, very, well, as a theatre person, this is what Brecht would call an interruption. You interrupt the curatorial scheme. And that is very, very important. Okay. We can take it later.
Yeah, we can. Okay, then we can break for tea. And thank you so much, Rustom, for this very, very open-ended, provocative, if I may say so,